Hello, everyone, and warmly welcome to this webinar on security and climate change. And my name is Anna Sundström, and I'm going to moderate this session. The webinar is arranged by the Olof Palme International Center in cooperation with the IPB and the ITUC. Once again, warmly welcome. We all know and see how the predicted impacts of climate change are becoming more and more visible. Environment and climate related risks, such as extreme weather events, water scarcity, and the failure to adapt and mitigate climate change, are among the top risks the world faces. Conflict and social tension grow as a consequence, and the conflict researchers have for long pointed to the fact that resources, or rather competition over resources, is an underlying explanation, trigger, or multiplier of conflict. But for far too long, the risks caused by climate change have not been given enough attention, especially not when it comes to mitigation and conflict prevention. So we need to use the knowledge and address climate-related security risks much more systematically than before, and even also before they turn into armed conflicts. In 1992, the Independent Commission on Disarmament and Security Issues, chaired by Olof Palme, launched the concept common security. And the basic idea of concept security is very simple. Security depends on the actions and reactions of potential adversaries. Hence, security must be found in common through dialogue and cooperation. Only cooperation can provide security that humans crave, where military competition and nuclear deterrence have failed. So in 2022, we will mark the 40th anniversary of common security and the report by the Olof Palme Commission. And we do that to get the Olof Palme International Center, together with IPB, the International Peace Bureau, and ITUC, International Trade Union Confederation, by commission a new project to look into common security in our age, its relevance, new threats to security that has come about since the 1980s, and of course, climate change being one of these issues. In a series of roundtable discussions, and this being one of them, we will discuss, as I said, the concept and its relevance of our day. And both the new and old threats to security, and how, in our mind, common security hold a key to handling the threats that we all face and the security threats. Together with us today to discuss the linkages between the climate crisis and security, we have Margot Wallström, who is a former Minister of Foreign Affairs from Sweden, and she's now chair of the CIPRI initiative, Environment of Peace. She's also joined, not only here today, but also in this panel by the former Prime Minister of New Zealand and patron of the Helen Clark Foundation, Mrs. Helen Clark, mostly welcome. And we also have with us Ulrich Eberle, the fellow of the Future of Conflict program of the International Crisis Group. And last but not least, Kumi Naidoo, Global Ambassador for Africans Rising for Peace, for Justice, Peace and Dignity. And I should, of course, also mention that both Helen Clark and Kumi Naidoo are two of the commissioners in the new Common Security project that we, as I mentioned, launched earlier this year. And you can follow us and the project and the development of a new report to be launched in April 22 on the website commonsecurity.org. But enough with introductions. We, of course, are very eager to discuss this topic and also to listen to our panelists. And I would like to pose my first question to both you, Margot Wallström, and Helen Clark, as you are part of this panel or this work that is ongoing also within CIPRI. Why is there a need for a coordinated agenda for peace and security in relation to climate change? What perspectives do you bring to this work? Margot, if you would like to start.
Thank you very much, and great to see so many qualified speakers on this panel. And I'm so proud also to have Helen on our international advisory panel for the CIPRI project that is called Environmental Peace. And first and foremost, based at CIPRI, and of course with experts also from CIPRI's research initiative on how best to secure peace in a context of profound environmental change, and environmental change that also is exacerbated by climate change. So it's to establish and explain those links between climate change, environmental problems, but also how this affects peace or our security environment around the world. And it will do so by different case studies, and it will also look at recommendations, basically, and we will deliver a major report next year to contribute to the discussion around the 50th anniversary of the first UN environmental conference in Stockholm. So we have a date with history, so to say, and unfortunately many of the predictions in 50 years ago have been realized, and I mean it not in a good way, but some of the threats that were identified already 50 years ago we see play out now in our time. And we have discovered, of course, that for example, lack of water, or if the environmental problems become too big, partly because of climate change, then that will also create, in some cases, social unrest, and it can lead to conflict and ultimately to war. This has been, and we tried when we served on the Security Council to place this whole issue on the Security Council's agenda. It's controversial because some countries really do not want to see that this is how it all plays out in the field, but we need to do more to get a better understanding of these mechanisms and the drivers, and we also need to have reporting from the field so that we can see the early warning signs, and we need to be able to prevent this. And I think what has happened in modern time is that the environmental problems, and I mean sort of traditional environmental policy, has ended up in the shadow of climate change very much. And I think we need to establish those links again, and we now also have to look at it from a peace and security aspect.
Thank you very much. And if I pose then the same question to you, Helen, also having been the Prime Minister for your country, it would be interesting also to hear you pick up on what Margot said about these issues being a bit neglected, and maybe even a bit controversial internationally when it comes to the discussions at government or international level.
Well, certainly controversial, as Margot said. And when Sweden was on the Security Council in recent years, it did a great job of endeavoring to raise the issues and make the links. I see there's been another discussion in the Security Council again this year, where Russia, for example, strongly objected to seeing climate change as a generic risk to peace and security. Notwithstanding, of course, that the Security Council itself has recognized the role that climate change has played in instability in Central African Republic, in Darfur, in Democratic Republic of the Congo, in Mali, in Somalia, and more widely in West Africa. So the links are recognized, but then to go that next step and really see it as fundamental to address climate change in order to address peace and security comprehensively is another thing. I think we face such a syndemic of issues in our world. I really fear for the world we're leaving to future generations, where we grapple with the climate challenge. But as Margot said, there are other major environmental challenges too, all linked again: the biodiversity challenge, the habitat loss, the impoverishment of those who once were able to subsist on the land. There's also quite a level of discussion now, and this has had some leadership from Sweden too, with respect to future pandemics and prevention at source, because where you have human encroachment on natural habitats, again, you run the risk of more zoonotic spillover diseases with pandemic potential. So, all of this is a heady mix for conflict. And as Margot said, the conflict may come from something as basic as being over scarce resources, access to water, access to arable land, creating tensions at the most basic levels of communities. I think what was always said about climate change when I was at UNDP is it's just a risk multiplier for every existing vulnerability and tension that we have, and we need to see it in this broad context.
Thank you both, and we're going, of course, to come back to a few of the topics that you've both raised. And I must also remind everyone who is following us that you can, of course, also pose questions and comments in the chat box, and we will try to pick up a few during the course of our discussions. But I thought that I would now like to turn to you, Ulrich, giving us a little bit of a background. When we talk about environment and climate crisis as being a multiplier of sensitivities or already existing threats, could you give us a few examples? How does this come about, and what effects does it get on the ground?
All right, sure. Would you like me to start the presentation as well?
Please do.
Very good.
I
very
have
good.
a few pictures you'd like to show us. So go ahead.
Perfect. And I would like to share my screen. Just 1 second, please. Very good. I hope you can see my screen well.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you, Anna, for inviting me to this wonderful event. My name is Ulrich Eberle. I am Crisis Group's climate expert and a postdoctoral researcher at Princeton University. And I have been working on climate security over the past 7 years, both academically as well as in the policy space. And over the next couple of minutes, I will provide you with an overview of the main climate trends, specifically this year, but also take a look at what the future will bring, and then show you where these climatic risk factors accelerate livelihood insecurity, as well as conflict dynamics. All right, to start with, where do we stand in terms of climate change? We are looking here at the last 1500 years, global average temperature. And we are at the very end of this curve. July 21 was the hottest month ever recorded. 2021 so far is in the top 10 of the hottest years, and the last decade is the hottest one. Since we are keeping systematic records since 150 years. And what that just underlines is that climate change is in full swing, and it is affecting us in many respects. Some of the risk factors will take longer to unfold, such as rising sea levels, Others are already in front of our doors, such as extreme weather. And the summer of 21 was one of extreme weather, such as storms and flooding that we have seen across Germany and Europe, costing the lives of almost 200 people, or a typhoon in China that displaced 1 million people. But also Nigeria, South Sudan, Turkey, India, all have suffered from deadly floods. And this increase in heat and also means more heat waves and fires. So, for example, this year in Pakistan and the Gulf, we witnessed temperatures that are beyond what humans can cope with. And the wildfires in California darkened the skyline of New York, as you all have seen in the news a couple of weeks ago. And more heat also means more drought. The US has experienced drought. For example, this June, more than a third of the country was under drought. And somewhere else in the world, in Madagascar, a country that does not have the coping mechanisms of the US, droughts have pushed the country on the brink of famine following the worst water shortages in 40 years. In many respects, the summer of 2021 was a summer of extremes. And it is no coincidence that the recently published IPCC report underlines the role of extremes for the first time explicitly. The IPCC report also underlines that we will reach the 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in global surface temperature compared to pre-industrial levels, likely already by 2040, and not as it was aimed at by the end of the century. The big question is, for today's discussion, how these climatic risk factors affect conflict dynamics. To motivate the relationship between climate and conflict, I would like to start showing you this map where we see the most climate fragile countries across the world. We look at issues like drought risk and flood risk. And among these countries, half of them today experience conflict and crisis. While this number is stark, it is important to underline that not every conflict is about climate change, but as we are progressing with global warming, the role of climatic distress plays ever more important role in many of today's conflicts. And as already mentioned earlier, it is very often considered as a threat multiplier. And for example, in the Sahel, that becomes very visible, as I will discuss in a minute. What is climate security about? It can be about many things. We already heard Anna discussing some of the issues. For example, flood-induced livelihood insecurity and displacement, or transboundary water disputes that we witness on the Nile and the Mekong. What is important to note that the majority of climate security risks are about water. It's either too much, too little, at the wrong place in the wrong time. And these changes, or climate change, will accelerate and change the supply of water. And so, for example, one part of the world here shown will experience less water available. That means less water for consumptions and less water for agriculture. And the regions we are talking about are the Middle East, Mexico, and Central America, for example. And when these shortages in water are poorly managed, poor governance combined with other grievances can spark protests and even lead to violence, as we have witnessed it in the south of Iraq. But more generally, where climate change disrupts livelihoods, armed groups may provide an economic alternative to agricultural incomes. The image I show you here, half of the rest of the world, is not shown yet, and the reason is that climate change is not just about drought and heat waves. The second part of the story really is about an increase in water supply. We speak about the Sahel and the Horn, where climate science already shows us that rainfall has increased in recent decades, and according to IPCC forecast, will continue increasing. And it sounds maybe good at first, but it is important to underline that this additional amount of water is very often distributed erratically, with prolonged droughts followed by extreme rainfall, as we have witnessed it, for example, in the Horn with flooding, or in the Sahel this summer where in Nigeria, for example, this floods have displaced 75,000 people. And the second part really is affecting many of the most climate insecure regions today, like the Horn, where we see a multitude of different climate security risk factors. And just to underline the second pattern, for example, in South Sudan, the floods over the last 3 years were of historic magnitude, especially the ones of 2021, have displaced more than 500,000 people to date. Some of them were herders, and some of them went to the south of South Sudan, to the Equatorial region, where the arrival of these herders further contributed to the bloodshed in the south of the country. We have a piece on that that will come out later this year. Another climate security risk factor, or climate security risk, can be observed across the Sahel. And it's usually referred to as farmer-herder violence. And farmer-herder violence, you see here, conflict events based on ACLED data. For Nigeria, farmer-herder violence is actually conflicts between farming and herding communities. And very often, these conflicts are over the competition over fertile soil. Disputes that are accelerated by climate variability, as a lot of research has shown us over the last couple of years. And for example, in Nigeria, over the last 10 years, each year, thousands of people die in these disputes over pasture and farmland. And it is important to conclude, it is important to underline that climate change might expose communities, but it is not an actorless threat. State weaknesses and particularly poor crisis response offer non-state actors an opportunity to step in, to extract resources and win the hearts and minds of climate fragile communities. We have seen such patterns already with Al-Shabaab in Somalia, with the group specifically targeting climate fragile communities, or in Mexico where gangs hand out food and hygienic products, so-called dispensas, in the aftermath of natural disasters and specifically after floods. And that gives these groups an opportunity to win the favor of local communities and to shift the political balance. Obviously, the list of climate security risks I just presented is not complete, but I hope it gave you a broad overview of the main mechanisms and pathways. These are the ones that we see at Crisis Group as the most urgent ones, and trusting climate forecasts and how it will affect livelihoods and induce distress in many regions of the world, it is likely that this list is getting longer. Thank you. Back to you, Anna.
Thank you so much for providing us with this knowledge and also understanding of many of the risks that you from Crisis Group also see in relation to the crisis that we are, right now in, we must say. Kumi, may I now turn to you, because you both come from a region that in Ulrik's presentation was over and over again highlighted as one area where we see climate change and environmental risks, also with the potential of causing social unrest and even conflict. And you represent the organization Africans Rising for Peace, Justice, Peace and Dignity. Sorry, I always tend to mix up the order of those three very important words. From your perspective and from your organization, how do you see this crisis piling up and also at the risk of causing conflict and deprivation for people on the African continent?
Thank you, Anna. Greetings, everyone. Just to start on a light note, I'm reminded of a moment during the South African liberation struggle. If you followed a list of wonderful statements like we've just heard, you started by saying most of the really good points I want to make have been eloquently made by the previous speakers, and then you spoke for about 1.5 hours. But let me be brief here. This linkage between climate and peace and security has been made a long time ago. Already in 2002, the CIA and the Pentagon had commissioned a study to look at what would be the future trends towards peace and security. And they said that in the coming decades, the biggest threats will not come from conventional threats or from terrorism, but will come from the impacts of climate change. And so what we are seeing for some time now on the African continent, that changes in climatic realities have actually had an impact. And as Ban Ki-moon, the former Secretary General of the UN, put it when reflecting on the violence and genocide in Darfur, recognized that this was probably the first major resource war brought about as a result of climate impacts, because Lake Chad, one of the largest inland seas in the world, as in the words of Ban Ki-moon, had shrunk to the size of a pond. And so water scarcity and then land scarcity, together with political manipulation by opportunistic leaders, provided the toxic mix for the horrific developments that we saw in Darfur. Unfortunately, throughout the continent, there are, in addition to what Ulrich clearly put on the table, there are examples of resource stresses, especially water and land, that have actually brought communities in conflict. If you take, for example, in northern Kenya, in around Lake Turkana, again, a massive body of historically fresh water, we had communities living in peace, irrespective of the multiple identities and diversities that existed amongst people. But now, when there is a crunch on resources, we're seeing the propensity to conflicts rising. So therefore, as we prepare for the climate COP in Glasgow in a couple of weeks' time, it's critically important that we put the question of peace and security as front and center in the climate negotiations. And hopefully doing that will bring a greater urgency to the challenge of addressing climate than we have seen from our political leaders in the past. I would conclude by saying that it's critically important that we recognize that what is at stake here is not saving the planet, actually. The planet, if we continue on the suicidal trajectory that we're on, the end result is we warm up our planet, which makes agriculture difficult. We dry up our water resources. We destroy our soil. The end result really is we will be gone. The planet will still be here. And truth be told, if we become extinct as a species, the forests will recover, the oceans will replenish, and so on. So we have to recognize that what is facing us right now is genuinely a struggle to secure the right of humanity to exist on this planet. And the IPCC report from August should have brought us all to a sense of urgency. That report makes it clear that we are running out of time, and that the huge gap between what the science and extreme weather is saying on the one hand and what political intervention is far, far too wide. So we need to recognize that we are nowhere near where we need to be. And one can only hope that by bringing in the peace and security component into the conversation around climate, including in Glasgow, will hopefully give the political will and the urgency that has been lacking for far too long already. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you highlight the need of bringing in peace and security into the the discussions on climate change. And both Margot and Helen, you in your introductions underlined that there is a resistance from many countries and governments to do this. And I would like to turn back to this and ask you, Margot, where do you think that this resistance come from? Why is there such a resistance?
Well, it comes from, for example, China and Russia, to be very direct if we look at the discussions in the Security Council, but there are others as well who does not want to disturb sort of our traditional definitions of peace and security with something like this. Kumi was absolutely right in pointing out that, for example, the Pentagon report from a number of years ago pointed to exactly what we are seeing now, and this as a source of unrest and conflict that could also lead to war. I've been thinking about something else, and we had a discussion the other day about the fact that if you ask psychologists or behavioral scientists, they say that the fact that we have not been able to act upon the consecutive reports sending out very strong warnings from the IPCC is because we have not been able around the world, or decision makers have not been able to look at climate change as an enemy, identified as an enemy that they then can sort of take action to take out or to defeat. But at the same time, we of course do not want for people to look at the environment as an enemy. Instead, we need to live in peace with the environment in order to be able to tackle also the climate change effects as we see them. But it is really about our ability to understand the urgency, as Kumi said as well, and to act upon what we hear and to act upon the scientific evidence that there is. And I just think that there is a lack of enough of studies to show the link and the casualties sort of that exists or does not exist when it comes to climate change, environmental problems, and how that can lead to conflicts. And I must say, after having visited the Lake Chad area myself, I think it couldn't be clearer in a way. This is already playing out the full spectrum of these effects in the Lake Chad area, and also how it affects actually terrorism, because when Lake Chad has shrunk so much, and what remains is a pond with small islands, you might say, the terrorists have taken refuge on these small islands. They bring women there, and they train suicide bombers. And I met with one of these young girls that had been identified as one of their potential suicide bombers. But unfortunately, the bomb went off too early and she lost both her legs. She survived, luckily, and decided that she would now fight for the other side. She would fight for the good. But also how they explained that when the pond was big fish was there, big boats, and the men were doing the fishing. Now the Lake Chad is small, and small fish, and no boats any longer, but nets that the women then bring, and they are the ones who can take care of the fish as well that they get. So it has changed the whole society, and of course herders and farmers and fishermen and the other will have a fight about the scarce water resources that are left. So I think we just need to do more to explain how it plays out in different situations, and everybody can understand that if the Blue Nile does not give enough water to Egypt, we have a conflict or even a war over water on our conscience.
Kumi, you had a reflection on what Margot just said.
Yeah, no, I wanted to just fully support that sentiments and say that we need to be making an appeal to our leaders now more urgently than we've done in the past. When I was at Greenpeace, several years ago, one of the things I always used to say was that we have the possibility of turning the crisis of climate change into an opportunity. For far too long, we've lived in a world that's been divided between North and South, East and West, developed and developing. And climate change, if we had leaders in the majority of our countries who are reading the science, who are not anti-science, and who are just being sensible, then we have to realize that we either get this right as rich and poor countries acting together, and hopefully we can secure the majority of humanity, because I think at this point we should not be lying. Lives are being lost as a result of climate change right now. For certain small island states, the prognosis of what could happen in the next 20 years is looking terrible. So, but I think we have an opportunity, and that opportunity is only if rich and poor nations come together, powerful and less powerful in military sense come together, and figure out, actually, if we don't act together, it's true that poor countries in Africa, for example, will pay the first and most brutal impacts from climate, even though Africa as a continent has contributed least to the problem. The injustice of it is clear. But in the end, as the events in Belgium and Germany just showed, and the events in Australia and the United States has shown, rich nations as well are not immune from these impacts. So part of what we need to do is change the narrative in terms of how we are approaching our advocacy to governments. We have to present this, ironically, in a way that is seen as an opportunity, because unless we present it in that way, I think our leaders are not going to respond. They've shown an inability to read and understand the science, and they still seem to suffer from a terrible case of cognitive dissonance, which is basically the denying of reality. And I think that I don't sit here with the solution, but especially to younger people who are more creative, who are thinking about how we can communicate. We need to bring in artists and cultural workers and so on to make this connection between peace, security, and climate in a way that makes it irresistible for our governments to continue to drag their feet and fail to act on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kumi. And well, you said you'd had no solution. So let me now then turn to you, Helen, and ask for a solution. No, I'm kidding a bit, but we've got a question also in the chat, and it was also one of the things that I, before this seminar, was thinking that I would like to ask you, who both together with Margot, of course, has also been very active on the global scene. And we know that only the United Nations budget is 1% of the total military spendings in the world. So we seem to invest a whole lot more, to say the least, in defense and armament and so on than we do in cooperation and multilateralism and so on. That is the way that we all agree would help us sort many of the challenges that we face. How can we turn this around to make sure that we also invest in what will actually keep us more secure and safe, namely international cooperation?
Well, trite to say it's a $64 question, but yes, the amount spent on the UN is just a trifle, a mere trifle compared with what goes on armaments. And we could extend that more broadly, couldn't we? That generally the amount spent on diplomatic efforts to address conflicts and disputes is infinitesimal. I was thinking as the others spoke about some of these conflicts arising out of water issues. Margot's already referred to, for example, the Nile and the downstream impact on Egypt. Without the Nile, there's no Egypt, and yet others obviously have plans for water upstream. There's another conflict which often goes overlooked, or latent conflict in Central Asia, where the building of the High Dam in Tajikistan has always been seen as deeply threatening to the food security, water security of Uzbekistan. So these conflicts are out there. Now, one of the problems we face is that the Security Council has never moved with the times. when we say that, we're often thinking of the locked-in permanent representation of the 5 countries deemed to have been the victors of World War II. But it's more than that. It's locked into a mindset about a very conventional kind of security threat, which is war between nations. The reality is we see less of that these days, and we see many other different kinds of conflicts which the Security Council can't deal with, let alone really have an in-depth way of addressing what is driving these conflicts, with the rise of the non-state actors, for example, in the Lake Chad basin countries, which then manifests itself in terrorism, which then invokes various efforts at the peacekeeping, peace building, military deployments, and so on. So certainly need for a deeper reflection. Geopolitics remains very toxic at the UN, not only between US and China, but also US-Russia relations not so good, Europe-Russia relations not so good, and this is not the ambience in which one can get the reasoned discourse on these sorts of issues. Nonetheless, I was rather struck, and it's a bit unlike me perhaps to quote Boris Johnson, but Boris Johnson went and spoke at the Security Council debate on climate change in February this year. And he said, and I quote words to the effect, if the suffering and strife caused by climate change was done at the hand of some kind of despotic warlord or civil war, then nobody would question the right and the duty of the UN Security Council to act. Well, he's right, isn't he? So I think we have to keep pressing at this, that the Security Council needs to be repurposed to address the range of threats that are undermining our common security these days, and a key one of these is climate change. Kumi is right. If we could address climate change effectively, we would have win-wins in so many ways. We'd have win-wins for peace and human security. We'd have win-wins for addressing intractable poverty and hunger. We'd have win-wins for biodiversity. It's a question of joining these dots and getting enough people seeing this bigger picture to put the pressure on governments to act. One last word on pressure on governments to act. I've been watching the Biden administrations wrestle with these issues, having returned to the Paris Agreement and obviously, wanting to make an impact at Glasgow. What is defeating their climate change and environmental measures? One of their senators who represents a coal state, not a Republican, but a Democrat. And that also speaks to the issue of focusing on just transitions, because if people think the measures one is going to take on climate action threaten their livelihood, they're going to be a beginner. So one has to find win-win ways of supporting our climate ecosystem while also ensuring that human beings have the means to survive and thrive.
Thank you. And this was also actually a perfect advertisement, you could say, for one of the upcoming panel discussions that we will have in the Project of Common Security 2022, where we look into inequality and the need for just transitions in order to also get the popular support needed for these transitions to really happen, and to push our political leaders to act. So keep an eye on the website commonsecurity.org for that discussion. But I want to, Helen, stay on a little bit on common security, as this is now something we in this project are wanting to sort of reinvent or whatever to adapt to the security threats of our days. And you said that, well, the international infrastructure that we've got, the UN and so on, is sort of still in a very traditional setting, say, looking at intrastate conflicts, or rather than interstate, or also these kind of social unrest caused by climate change and etc. So how do you see that the concept of common security can sort of help us unlock a few of these static infrastructure, if you like?
Well, first, can I say that when I was a young Social Democratic Party activist and activist on many causes, from apartheid to nuclear disarmament and against the Vietnam War as a student and young person, Olof Palme was one of my heroes. So I always followed what he did. And one of the highlights of my 20s years was coming to a major Social Democratic youth camp in Sweden and hearing Olof Palme speak. It was amazing. And I'm just so happy that there's still a centre in his name taking forward his ideas. To pursue a common security agenda, of course, you have to appreciate that we as human beings have a common interest. And I sometimes think in the toxicity of geopolitics, we put that aside. Countries become so consumed by their particular political value systems and the rights and wrongs of those. And let's face it, there are very substantial differences between us. But if every time we enter a discussion, we run into that roadblock, we'll never be able to progress. And I think it's very important at the global level that we start to identify more where we really need to come together as humanity. And if we can make multilateralism and cooperation work in those areas, it might just have a positive spillover effect more generally. And clearly those areas include action on our climate crisis, action on our biodiversity crisis, action to reform the global architecture around pandemic preparedness and response and the legal instruments for that, so we don't end up in the kind of mess we're in currently again. So I'm very much for countries looking at, well, okay, we know what we disagree on from basic value systems, but what could we agree on where we could start to explore and build a cooperation on critical challenges of our times. And I think the international community has really been spectacularly bad at that. When you look, for example, at the reaction to the pandemic, there was an attempt at one point in the first half of last year to get a sort of sensible resolution on pandemic preparedness through the Security Council. And it founded on the rock of what the virus would be called and so on. And it proved impossible to get it declared a threat to global peace and security, even though Ebola, which represented in the end a lesser threat, had been several years before. And yet you reflect on the fact that when this attempt to get such a resolution went down, it actually went down on the 40th anniversary of the eradication of smallpox. And the eradication of smallpox was entered into at the height of the Cold War, where everyone came together and said, this is such an incredible threat to the health of the world, we will act as one. Now, isn't that the kind of spirit that we need? I think also of the reaction to Chernobyl. Chernobyl tragedy came towards the end of the Cold War. Things weren't good between great powers. Notwithstanding that, within 5 months of the Chernobyl nuclear accident, the world had negotiated 2 new international conventions and far-reaching information sharing and collaboration which hadn't been seen before. So we're missing something at the moment. And I just think we all have to work in whatever way we can to revive that concept of our shared interest. Look, Antonio Guterres has a new report out. It's called Our Common Agenda. It's had quite a lot of consultation with civil society and non-member state stakeholders. Some member states are upset, apparently, that they weren't consulted with enough. But we need to run with it. It's tackling the right issues, and maybe through getting in behind a major report like this from the Secretary General, we can start to bring in again the concepts of common security through pursuing our common agenda.
Thank you very much. And I would like to ask Kumi, you the same question. You are also one of the commissioners to this work that is now ongoing. And from your perspective, how could the concept of common security unlock a few of these blockages that we have when it comes to the global architecture, and also the lack of interest in global cooperation?
I think at one level, both the pandemic and climate are very important teachers to us as a species, right? What it's saying very clearly, there have been many other examples as well before this, but the pandemic, more than anything else, has shown that we as a human family on this planet, right, don't have a choice but to be able to understand that one country's security is completely linked to other countries' security. This, and sadly, the rich nations of the world, in the way they've behaved in response to the pandemic, has not helped at all, right? Because they've sort of sent a message: we will look at our own societies first, and let Africa and all wait, for a long time. So we have failed the test with regard to the pandemic. I think the idea of common security, which needs to be pushed really, really hard, we need to find accessible ways to explain this, which basically says that today we live in a world, more so than before, where a range of threats do not respect national boundaries. Pandemic, climate, and a whole range of other things. And unless we can give real expression to that and move. But by the way, it's not as if anything that I've said, our leaders in most countries don't accept. They accept it conceptually, notionally, all of that. The challenge for us is, how do we get that to be translated into action? And how do we generate the kind of political will that allows leaders to sometimes go against nationalistic sentiment in their own countries, right? When it's actually in the long-term interest of their own citizens as well as others in the world. Now, while this is not easy, I think the crises that we have lived through, particularly the pandemic, should be bringing home the idea to any sensible leader, whether in civil society, government, or business, that this has to be a time for a common approach to common problems that don't respect borders, don't respect ideologies, don't respect any other things that divide us as a human family. And unfortunately, we are not where we need to be. And I agreed to serve on the commission now because I hope that the work of the commission can add the impetus to this debate when the report comes out next year. Thank you.
Margot, please, you wanted to comment.
Thank you very much. First of all, when we decided that we wanted to introduce the topic of climate change and the link to peace and security in the Security Council, we realized that there were at least 3 conditions that needed to be fulfilled. First of all, we needed a kind of institutional home for this whole issue within the UN system. And maybe that is also what we will have to look at for the future. We needed to make sure that we had the latest of scientific knowledge and expertise. And that is maybe to build on already existing networks and then draw from that. And then we needed the reports from the field. So in-country reports, we needed to better understand what is going on, what can be seen as early warning signs that will identify climate change impact that can lead to security problems. And I think it is very often as if the Security Council is frozen in time, with everything from the use of veto and the composition and the efficiency, despite efforts recently to modernize the whole system. And I think Guterres should have all the credit for doing so and continuing to reform. But then look at what we have. We have an Agenda 2030. We have a sustainable development agenda. And actually it says also, it highlights that sustainable development cannot be realized without peace and security, and peace and security will be at risk without sustainable development. So the interlinkage there. And that should also encourage us to then take action, as Kumi and Helen has already said. I really think that, like we have been fighting to get the issue of women's involvement in peace and security and establish that through, again, a number of resolutions and actions, and also changing the way the UN works, we will have to do the same when it comes to the link between security, climate change and the environment, and peace and security. So it will take a lot of more efforts. And remember, we live also today in a time of militarization. And unfortunately, there seemed to be a lot of money to invest in modernizing nuclear weapons, for example, or increasing the military budgets in country after country. So don't say that there is no money to take action also on climate change or environmental problems. And I do believe that as much as we look forward to the meeting in Glasgow, we should look at what happened in Kunming, the meeting where biodiversity was discussed, because this is almost as serious to our existence on this planet as the threats of climate change. So I think that to establish those kinds of intricate links and complex context, I think to do that is a noble task and a formidable task for our project, Environment of Peace, but we will try to contribute in our report for next year. And again, thankful for all the input and the ideas that come out. So it's really about, as Kumi said, also the conceptual understanding of all of this has to be there. And then we have to find the necessary actions. How can we put it on top of the agenda? How can we start to act in an effective way?
Thank you so much. Necessary actions, absolutely. Ulrich, you also wanted to comment, please.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to reflect on cooperation at different levels that I believe are necessary to tackle the climate security threats that are evolving. On the one side, at the regional level, it's necessary to understand that climate change doesn't stop at national borders. For example, farm-herder violence is an issue that is visible across the Sahel. And it doesn't stop at borders. And it's also important to underline that these communities live together in peaceful symbiosis for a long while, and climate change disrupted this symbiosis. So there is a lot of ground for cooperation. The same is true for transboundary water disputes. Around 80% of the transboundary water disputes, for example, caused by dams, are resolved peacefully. It is a source of cooperation. And climate change, for example, by causing floods and so on, dams are there like a sponge. They can regulate these changes in water supply, and it can be a benefit a whole larger region with electricity and water for irrigation. But it's not only important to cooperate at the local level to find these solutions, also at the global level. I think right now the discussion is still stuck at something very important about emissions, and that is it's essential, obviously, to curb climate change and global warming to hopefully under 2 degrees Celsius. But it's also harder or it's also very abstract discussion we are having, and it's important the work such as the one of CPRI that looks specifically into these pathways that show us how people are affected by climate change directly, but also how, for example, Western countries will be affected indirectly. And I think there is a necessity to act collectively on all these levels. And for example, the UN Security Council resolution draft that is circulating right now has some of these aspects, integrating across different levels and across different regions, and integrating science as well.
Thank you very much, and also for reminding us that this is also actually a source for cooperation. And I think that Kumi also highlighted this in earlier, the importance of also seeing this as an opportunity for this sort of collective action and for a joint response. So we are about to round up, and I would like to ask the final question to you, Margot, and ask you for us now in the Common Security Commission 2022, and as mentioned, both Helen Clark and Kumi Naidoo are commissioners to this commission. Do you have any recommendation for us now going forward, looking into this concept of common security and trying to once again push the world to realize that only through collective action and cooperation we can make our world more safe and secure?
Don't we need the positive vision? We need to hear that, first of all, we are capable of changing things around. And we need to understand, and we of course know this, but we need to hear it again, that the destiny of the others is also our destiny, like never before. And we need to hear that there is a chance to get a better future. And I think we have to again focus on children, focus on the next generation, establish a long-term thinking about politics. And in order to do so, we need to work together, common. It's a common future if we also ensure a common security.
Thank you very much, and I think that these were perfect also final words for this webinar, the importance of also remembering that we are the ones that are also capable of changing the world. We have done it before, and we for sure will continue to do so, and as mentioned, to make sure that we leave a better world behind. So thank you to all of you for participating, to Helen Clark, to Margot Wallström, to Olof Palme, and to Kumi Naidoo. Thank you so much. And once again, do not forget to continue to follow the work of the Common Security Commission 2022 on our website, commonsecurity.org. Thank you to all of you, and goodbye.